Many people experience the urge to build something with their own hands. When Michael Pollan left his position as executive editor at Harper's Magazine, he decided to pursue that urge. With some help from an architect and a carpenter, he constructed a cabin in the woods near his home. Even more than providing him with a writing space, the entire process gave him a chance to reflect on the meaning of work itself. His thoughts are contained in his new book, A Place of My Own, and I am pleased to have him on this broadcast. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Where did the idea come from? I mean, when you look back now and you see this book, and here's a picture of the house that was in the New York Times Magazine, Building a Room of My Own. I assume this is an excerpt from the piece, but and there it is. That's the house that he built, the study that he built, and somewhere in here there are other pictures. But the idea.
Well, the idea came from, I was leaving the magazine, I was moving up to the country, I was going to be a writer full-time. I was also at the same time having a baby. And so I was struck by this very ordinary dream for a room of my own. I mean, a place where I could work and daydream and have, basically a little temple of solitude. The other part of the idea, though, was that I had this craving to do something with my hands. I, like most people these days, make my living in front of a computer screen.
Yeah, exactly.
And work is how we situate ourselves in the world, and my work, and as is the work of many people today, put me in a very sort of abstract, glancing relationship to the world.
Let me just pick up on that point and make sure I understand it. You wanted to work with your hands.
Yeah, like a lot of people these days, my work put me in a very sort of abstract, glancing relationship to reality, to the world. I work in front of a computer screen. And I was very eager to have a more direct engagement with nature, with things, so that was one thing that attracted me to it. Despite the fact, I should say, I was completely unprepared. Had no background as a builder. Yeah. My father was the least handy man I think I've ever known. He was a great indoorsman who delegated all tasks in the physical world to others. And when I started, didn't even know the proper way to hold a hammer. I'm sort of embarrassed to admit. I held it like a tennis racket, with my thumb up here along the side, very dainty, like I was getting ready for a backhand, and I had to learn the correct way to hold a hammer in order to drive a nail.
What's the correct way to hold a hammer?
Well, what I learned from Joe Benny, who was my Virgil in the carpentry area, was that you should move your thumb down around the shank, which you give up a little control, but you get a lot of power. So what was an action of the wrist suddenly becomes an action of the whole arm. Yeah. So you bring your whole arm.
I always thought the key to using a hammer had to be in terms of focus, making damn sure that you were watching the damn thing.
Very important. I did hit my thumb more than once. But my very ill-preparedness was an attraction for me. I mean, I wanted to go into unfamiliar territory.
Yeah. And so what did you learn?
God, well, I learned a lot about work. I learned a lot about architecture.
I know about architecture. What did you learn about work, and what did you get out of working with your hands?
I guess what I got was a deepened respect for reality, which sounds like a very abstract thing to say, but I learned that that materials are very important, and they sort of tell us what to do with them, and that a cedar shingle wants to be something that a brick doesn't want to be, and a piece of fur, It's funny, I see myself as sort of a nature writer, actually, which is kind of a funny thing to be writing about, but I like to write about nature when I'm changing it, when I'm engaging it, when I'm doing things to it. And I found that I learned more about a fir tree by having one killed and chiseling it, mortising it, than I think I would have learned just looking at it and having Thoreauvian thoughts about it.
It reminds me, I once actually had a carpenter who was part American Indian, native Indian, and he was going to cut a tree on my property because he was dead. And he actually prayed on it. I mean, it was amazing the kind of mystical relationship he had to the tree as a carpenter before he could move it out of the way in order to engage.
That spiritual sense of trees and what we're doing to them is still there. I mean, even on a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, you'll see people raising a spruce tree when they've completed the frame of the building and putting it up at the top, or even on in the suburbs, you'll find them nailing a pine bough to the top of a new frame. And I did this at the end of, when we had our frame ready. There's a scene in the book where I describe this. And I was very curious to find out what is that ritual about.
Yeah.
And because it's one of these, it's a sacrifice ritual. And it's this moment of great joy. You've completed this new habitation. But it's also, there's a little bit of shame in it too, because you've killed a great tree to do it. Yeah. And so it's a ritual that, as you know, with the Indian you're describing, would sort of write your relationship to the tree.
All right, at this point, after the doing of it, the Thoreau, whether it is or not like a Thoreau experience for you, but do you think somehow you were saying something about the future and working at home and the idea of more and more people looking to...
Yeah, I think that's part of it. You know, I built a writer's hut, but these days I realized at a certain point that more and more people are leading the writer's life, which that you can work at home and telecommute. Even where I live in a pretty rural area, about 100 miles from New York. There's an ISDN line that comes down the dirt road and leads to a trading room.
So you got high-speed access now?
I have high-speed access, but it leads to a trading room. There's a risk arbitrageur in the woods with his own little hut.
Oh, I see.
A few hundred yards behind me.
He's got a Bloomberg terminal is what he's got in there.
Exactly. And he has a trading desk, and he deals with the street in live time.
And never leaves.
Well, he actually just does this for his summer, for 3 months in the summer.
Oh, I see. So it's a summer thing.
Yeah, it's a summer thing. But more and more people are leading this life, which you can do just about anywhere. And so I realized the writer's life is kind of becoming a little bit more general. For me... I
mean, are you comfortable to be there and to spend a lot of time there?
I can, you know, I designed... The book, the building is a cockpit. Yeah. It's really designed like... Charlie Meyer, who's the architect on this, I went to him and I said, I really want a little space, a cockpit, something that ship-shape, everything in its place. I'd never have to get up. And I would feel, and in fact, once I sit down in that cockpit, and I've got my windshield and I'm looking out at the world, I feel like if I got up, I'd crash. I mean, you have to stay there. You're really sort of strapped in.
All right, let's take a look at the place. Okay, here is the New York Times Magazine story of building a room of my own. I mean, there's where the cockpit is inside. Slide 2. What's this?
This is Joe Benny, my guide, and I are doing the footings. The building sits on 4 large rocks, which is a very nice, simple, rustic idea that such as an architect might have, but in fact requires a lot of subterfuge to pull off, because each of those rocks has to sit on a 4-foot concrete pier. So we had to drill each rock and drive a pin through it so that they wouldn't move in the frost.
Next slide. Beginning construction.
These are the fir posts that we've mortised and tenoned. It's modified post and beam, and so the first step is putting up these posts, and you build around those.
Next slide.
That's Charlie Meyer in the background. He's the architect who we've sort of forced to work with us to get a little practical experience of the complications involved in his conceptions.
Next slide.
This is after we've raised the ridge beam, which is the most triumphant moment, I think, in building. And here we're putting up rafters.
All right, slide next.
More rafters. Yeah. Charlie, Joe, and I.
Next. There it is.
That's the completed frame, and that's me in there. And that's the day that I went and found a bough and pinned it to the roof.
Next slide. Plywood on top of the frame.
Yeah, the 3 of us.
Next slide. There it is, without the interiors done.
Right.
All right. What's the dimension of this?
It's only about 8.5 by 13. It's very small.
Next slide. There it is.
It's the building lit up at night after it was completed.
And once the landscape architect finished.
Oh, no, I was the landscape architect.
I know. Next slide. There it is in winter. All right, interior. Let's see the interior. There it is.
There's my cockpit.
Yeah. Now, what wood did you use?
It's mostly fir.
The Douglas fir or some other kind
Douglas
of
fir, and there's a little bit of pine, but it's mostly fir. The desk is ash, however.
Yeah. How much time, how many hours a day you spend out there?
Now, 7, 8.
7 or 8 hours?
Day, yeah. Well, I'm a writer full time, and this is where I do
So you start early in the morning?
Yeah, I get started early in the morning, and there's very little reason to get up.
All right. So somebody reads your book and says, I want to do this. I have the same inspiration. What's your best advice to them?
Get
an architect and get a contractor.
Get an architect, yes. I think architecture, you know, people pay a premium for architecture and the ideas they have, but they also can make a space much more uplifting than it would be otherwise. And find a carpenter, and find an architect and a carpenter who can talk to one another. That is a very rare thing. You know, they're two the architect...
They have disdain for each other in part.
Deep disdain that goes back 100 years to the moment where the architects took over cultural authority from the house wrights or carpenters. They used to run the show in building a house, and now the carpenters have taken over. But they also have completely different philosophies of life. I mean, one is is dealing with the ideal, and the other is dealing with practical matters. And I found myself caught. I mean, the drama of this book, such as it is I'm stuck between a carpenter, a great carpenter, and a great architect, and they're vying for my attention and trying to get me on their side. Yeah. And there are two different life principles at work there.
It can be symbiotic, though. I mean, it can be, in a sense, an architect says, here is my concept, make it stand.
Yeah.
You know, make it work.
Yes.
Okay.
But it takes still a craftsman. I mean, my architect had a wonderful concept for windows opening in, but to make them actually work so they didn't leak required a lot of craftsmanship.
Did writing about this enhance the experience or detract from it?
Enhanced it.
Yeah.
I knew very soon after I started that I was going to be writing about it, that I realized that I wanted to talk about architecture in this book, and that the best way to do it, I'm not a great noticer, and the best way to do it was to experience it, and that's one of the reasons I also did it. And so this was my education in architecture as well, and to learn about the place of the body in architecture, and how to basically make a space that was a personal expression. That was me.
A place of my own, the education of an American builder with thoughts on architecture. Well, Michael Pollan, thank you very much. Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back. Stay with us.